On October 30th, 1938, Mercury Theater on the Air did a radio play on CBS Radio. By 8:30 p.m., law enforcement had stormed the station. By 9 p.m., the theater troupe had to sneak out the back door. And by midnight, Times Square was lit up with a news briefing. Orson Welles causes mass hysteria. Some weeks prior, Orson Welles had decided that he and his theater troupe were going to do a radio play that felt real. And after looking through a couple of pieces, he finally settled on one. H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. Now, the story depicts an alien invasion, and the story is set in Europe, so Orson Welles decides to make it more realistic. He's going to pull the setting to America. Now, he was working on another show at the time as well, so he had the theater troupe just kind of practicing, doing their thing, and by all accounts, everybody said that this was stupid. It was going to be really dumb, and everybody was going to laugh at it. So Orson Welles hears this, and he is not happy. He comes in the day before. He's like, y'all are short-sighted. Y'all are not creative. Like, what is going on? We have to change all of this, and demands rewrites and redos on a bunch of stuff in the script. They also had mechanisms for making realistic sounds in the studio, so it would sound like something was actually happening. Now, the play broadcast started like this. The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, if they did all that, why would anybody think it's real? We skip the opening credits all the time. It usually don't matter. A lot of people just skip the opening credits and was listening to something else or was doing something else. Then Orson Welles came in. We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as its own. Very narration heavy, so you would still probably know it's the play. But they missed that part too. Then, after the prologue, the play began. And the play was basically music and a series of breaking news stories in between the music. Something like what you'd hear on the radio. First, the radio announcer fades in. The next 24 hours, not much change in temperature. Okay, so pretty much if you came in anywhere after this, you might think this was real. Because at this point... Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. It felt real. And at first, the special bulletins came in kind of slow. And then gradually more and more and more, and then it got worse and worse and worse. Meanwhile, folks over in Nova Scotia had them things out ready to do what had to be done. And there were a lot of people calling radio stations and newspapers trying to figure out exactly what was going on. Now, what made matters worse is that Welles decided to move the call announcement from 8:30 until 8:40 so that he could keep the momentum going in the play. Call announcement is the thing that lets you know the radio station you're listening to and the city you're listening to it in. And it usually happened every 30 minutes on the hour. So you'd hear, you're listening to WKRP in Cincinnati. WKRP in Cincinnati. But during special news bulletins, they don't do those call announcements because it's special news. So when they didn't hear the call announcement at 8:30, people were like, oh no, this is real. So the radio producers were able to hold law enforcement off. Every news source pretty much publicly condemns Orson Welles. The next day, he has to meet with all the news people and issue a public apology. And now there's an FCC law that you can't do a fake hoax on the radio because of this. Here's a snippet of the article from the New York Times about that night. A wave of mass hysteria sees thousands of radio listeners between 8:15 and 9:30 o'clock last night. Now let's look at some statistics from that night. At this point in time, the way they would figure out who was listening to what is they would literally call the house. They would say, hey, what are you listening to right now? And they would write it down and they would measure it against all the other people who answered the phone and said what they were listening to. The C.E. Hooper rating service reported that only 2% of national respondents were tuned into Wells's broadcast on 30th October 1938. The rest were either listening to something else, most likely ventriloquist Edgar Bergen's Chase and Sanborn Hour, one of the most popular programs on the radio, or nothing at all. Not only that, the claim was that this radio play stirred terror through the United States, made people frightened. There was something else I heard about recently that they said invoked terror and made people feel frightened. Ah, yes, Nosferatu. And no one thought that was real. So let's talk about what was really going on. In 1933, FM radio was patented, which meant that there was less interference and more people could just have radios in their homes. And by the mid-1930s, 40% of households had a radio and were getting their news from those radios. And those paper boys yelling on the corner aren't just for show. They were selling papers. And the number of papers that they were selling was decreasing because people didn't need it if they were getting their news from the radio. So imagine how convenient, horrible it is that this 23-year-old goes on the radio and starts spouting all this fake news, getting everyone up in a tizzy. People are ending their own lives, checking themselves into institutions to get shock therapy, weeping in the streets. So while Orson Welles was himself interviewed and basically forced to apologize for doing this in lieu of getting sued, all the headlines make sure to mention radio, so that you know this was radio's fault. Because, of course, newspaper would never do anything like this to you. You can trust us. The truth is, at the time, newspaper knew that they didn't have the means to be as entertaining as radio at the time. So instead of trying to figure out better ways to engage its audience and find more readership, they picked a scapegoat and they ran with it. Everyone ran with it. So it's funny when you think about it, because the newspapers actually succeeded in sharing fake news, but the fake news didn't work because they never became bigger than radio ever again. And they also made Orson Welles into a legend at 23 years old. Funny enough, on December 7th, 1941, Orson Welles was giving this really patriotic performance on the radio when he was interrupted by a special bulletin. You know, this one? People who were listening to the broadcast that he was on thought he was just doing the War of the Worlds thing again. So they didn't believe it at first. Nobody ever talks about that. That's messed up. And aside from all that, if you bothered to listen to the end, you would have heard this. This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. This is just how they said boo.